This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Matt Stoller is a fellow with the Open Markets Institute and an expert on competition, on what it is that leads companies or groups of people to bring their ideas forward in a marketplace, to invent and sell things. When investors or companies band together to really dominate a market, it can squash other people's ideas out and limit the possibilities that are available. In the US and more than 120 other countries, laws have been enacted to constrain that excess, to prevent companies from crowding innovation and ideas out of the marketplace. There are a lot of conversations happening in the US right now about whether our own antitrust laws, which were written more than 100 years ago, are sufficient for the current age in which we live, where a few companies control most of the information we receive and most of the things we buy. Matt Stoller is an expert on these antitrust laws, on their history, and on how they're being applied today. We talked to him about consolidation in food, entertainment, tech, and other industries, as well as how policymakers are responding. As a quick reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us or to sign up for our very special newsletter, which will give you our best of delivered right to your inbox once or twice per month, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Monday featuring Julia Davis of The Daily Beast. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
I was wondering if you could tell us about Chicago school competition theories and how these theories might be different from the outlook of the antitrust team that President Biden has assembled.
So from the late 19th century, when the first federal antitrust statute was passed, it was 1890, all the way up into the 1970s, we looked at concentrated corporate power and said, that's dangerous. If you have corporations that are too big, they dominate markets. They can dominate workers. They can dominate their own employees. They can dominate rivals. They can dominate consumers. And that domination is dangerous for a republic, right? It's very much like checks and balances on the political side. You want checks and balances in the economy. And that's what antitrust was. So that's how we enforced it. We said, okay, if there aren't enough rivals in this market, and if the firms are too big, then we suspect there's probably something bad going on. Some of the behavioral that was problematic would be things like tying two products together or pricing below cost to drive your competitors out of business, sort of things like that. In the 1970s, there was this change where people from what became known as the Chicago School, because they came out of the University of Chicago, and they said, no, that's the wrong way to think about antitrust. It's not about power. It's all about efficiency. So we don't care if there's one firm providing everything, as long as they do it cheap and consumers get good prices. And that was known as the Consumer Welfare Standard, which was really a rewrite of antitrust laws, although they didn't formally rewrite them. So in the 80s and 90s, you saw Walmart expand, right? Walmart the slogan is everyday low prices. And that is very much the consumer welfare model. And firms like Amazon and Google and Facebook and across the economy, you saw lots of consolidation. In the financial crisis, with too big to fail being a big slogan, people started to notice there are problems when you consolidate power, a whole bunch of different problems. And since then, we've sort of started a movement that says, let's go back to the original way that we enforced antitrust law, where we just said concentrations of power are dangerous. We need rivals in markets to create checks and balances on the firms in those markets so that they can't dominate anyone. The team that Biden has picked to run the antitrust agencies, Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission and Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ Antitrust Division, and then there's a couple of other slots, really believes that we should go back to the pre-Chicago School way of doing antitrust. There's a big battle right now in the courts and kind of in public opinion about whether to do that.
So specifically, Lena Khan became, I don't know, an academic star, I guess you could say, because of the Amazon's antitrust paradox. I was wondering if you could kind of get a little bit deeper into that theory and why it's so groundbreaking and picked up so much public notoriety.
Yeah, so Lena Khan, she graduated from college either during or right after the financial crisis and became a journalist. And she wrote a bunch of stories about monopoly power and just talked to business people, looked at things like the poultry industry or the candy industry. She looked at Amazon and a bunch of airlines and noticed that there was this consolidation of power going on and wrote about it. And then she went to law school. And while at law school, she wrote this paper, which was called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, which was named after the famous book by the guy who ran the Chicago school. His name is Robert Bork. And he wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox in 1978, which transformed the way that people understood antitrust policy. So she wrote this paper called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, which was a repudiation of Bork. And she did it by looking at Amazon and said, how is it that we have these antitrust laws that are supposed to restrain large corporations and promote competition, and yet Amazon, which is one of the most dominant firms that we've ever seen in history, exists and flourishes. So that was the premise of the paper, that's the paradox of having antitrust laws and yet having just massive corporate dominance at the same time. And what she did is she traced the growth of Amazon to the particular way that we enforce antitrust law according to the Chicago school, which focuses only on price theory. Because we only focus on price theory, Amazon was able to build a massive apparatus by offering low consumer prices or the perception of low consumer prices. But then on the other side of the market, to suppliers who actually make and sell goods, third party merchants who use Amazon's marketplace, workers who staff and supply Amazon with labor, and so on and so forth, Amazon was able to cram down. They had superior bargaining power against all of them. So that's where Amazon was exploiting its monopoly power, was on the other side of the market. And what Khan traced that to was a particular tactic. There's a series of tactics she went into, but the main one was something called predatory pricing law, which it used to be that you couldn't price below cost in order to drive your rivals out of business, because if you can do that, then all that matters is whether you have access to Wall Street funding. And if you do, then you can drive everybody else out of business because you can just underprice them until they can't stay in business anymore. And then you can change your pricing. The courts basically got rid of predatory pricing law in the 1970s and 1980s. And as a result, Amazon was able to build an entire business around underpricing its rivals to drive them out of business. Amazon also did a bunch of other things. But the paper was so important because it was the first time someone had looked at Amazon not as a business success story, but as a creature of law. And that catapulted Lena Khan into sort of academic antitrust stardom. After that, she did a bunch of other interesting things, but that's the story of that paper.
So, Matt, you've introduced us to Lena Khan and also to Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ, these thinkers who are influencing the way that the government is approaching antitrust policy. And one of the kind of key ways, the most identifiable ways for the public in how antitrust evolves is these mergers. And at DOJ, the way that they approach these mergers. So could you tell us a little bit about what are the merger cases that are ahead right now that the government is considering? And do you think that we're going to see a different approach on these specific cases than we've seen on previous mergers?
It's a great question. We're in the midst of a merger wave that is I don't want to say it's unprecedented because it's not unprecedented, but it's still really large. And that's for a number of reasons. There were a substantial number of mergers in 2019, but then because of the pandemic and the Federal Reserve supplying cheap capital to Wall Street, the number of mergers has increased by 50%, doubled, something like that. It's just a massive, massive number of mergers. I can't tell you what mergers are on deck because there's just so many of them. But one of the interesting things about this merger wave is that you aren't seeing as many acquisitions by large technology firms because they are worried about regulatory risk. So I guess the main mergers to note there's two of them that recently the FTC blocked. There was a merger between NVIDIA and ARM. They're both semiconductor firms. ARM is a supplier to NVIDIA. So NVIDIA is a customer of ARM. And then another merger was Lockheed Martin was trying to buy a rocket maker. So Lockheed Martin is a prime defense contractor. They make missiles, and they were trying to buy Aerojet, which makes rocket engines. And Aerojet is a supplier to Lockheed. So Lockheed is a customer of Aerojet. Now, those two mergers are called vertical mergers, which means that it's not a rival buying a rival. And when a rival buys a rival, it's much easier to understand the problem as, okay, well, he wants to take a competitor off the market. That's called a horizontal merger. And horizontal mergers still get challenged on a regular basis. These two mergers are vertical mergers. So it's a customer buying a supplier. And both of them were blocked, or both of them, the FTC said, no, we don't think this is a good idea. It's too much concentration of power. For a variety of reasons, we think that they can exploit that power against their rivals. And both of them gave up before they even went to court. The reason that's important is because the government has not successfully litigated a vertical merger in 4 decades. The last vertical merger litigation was AT&T Time Warner under the Trump administration, and the government lost. So to have 2 different companies give up on vertical mergers without even going to court is a big deal. So that's a significant change in merger policy that Lina Khan has already established. The other one is, I believe that Penguin is trying to buy Simon & Schuster. That's the number 1 book publisher trying to buy, I think, the number 3 or number 4 book publisher. The DOJ, and this is Jonathan Cantor, they are suing to block that, not on traditional consumer welfare grounds, saying that they're going to raise book prices. They're actually doing it on saying that book authors are going to have less of an opportunity to sell their books to publishers. So if there were formerly maybe 5 publishers at an auction, now there will only be 4, and there will be fewer bids. So the authors won't be able to get as much money for their books. And this will reduce both wages of authors and also the diversity of books that are produced. Now, this is important because it's the first merger challenged on what is called labor monopsony grounds, or, not the consumer area. I mean, they're making consumer arguments as well, but really this is a merger that's being challenged on labor grounds. So those are innovative merger challenges. And I think you're going to see more of those kinds of innovative legal challenges going forward. The other thing is both the DOJ and FTC together are rewriting what are called the merger guidelines, which are the way that the government actually thinks about mergers and tells the business community and the courts that it understands what violations of merger law are. It put out a request for information. Anyone can submit a comment saying what they think about mergers, and they're due on March 21st. You can get the request for information on the FTC's website if you want to. This is a huge controversy in the antitrust world. It should be a huge public controversy because it is all the money and power in the country. But that's something else that's going on. And I think we're going to see a lot of other interesting challenges. Amazon MGM is one that I'm looking at. And I think Google is thinking of buying Mandiant. And, there's a lot of private equity roll-ups. So there's a ton of stuff happening in the merger world that we're paying attention to.
So, Matt, it's all very exciting kind of looking at a possible new approach to these mergers. And I think that most people in the public are very pleased to see it. It's hard to think of something that's more unpopular broadly across the country than consolidation, right? But it's so rare that there's a real win-win for everyone in any kind of regulatory policy sphere. So are there any kind of trade-offs that you think that people should be aware of or cognizant of as we're shifting in our approach to antitrust and to mergers? Do you think that it might have some impact on prices, efficiency? Is there any kind of negative aspect of this that we should be prepared for as we approach this new era?
I think I'm going to give a little bit of an odd answer. Self-government is scary. When the government steps in and blocks a merger, it's almost always good for everyone. But what's going to happen is there's going to be scare stories that Wall Street and the powerful entities are going to put out. And they're going to put them out through people that you might trust. They'll put them out through professors. They'll put them out through lawyers, through people on TV, and through economists. And they'll say, you're not going to get the medicine you need, or you're not going to get the technology that you want, or this is going to increase the prices that you have to pay for food or for gasoline or whatever it is. And it's not going to be true, but they're going to say that. And you're going to have to make decisions for yourself about what you think. What is really scary about this area of policy is that it has to do with things that seem really complicated and technical. It also has to do with a lot of people who are very confident in asserting what they think and who gets to speak and who doesn't. We typically think of these people as economists, but there's a bunch of lawyers as well. And they will say how stupid you are for thinking that consolidation is a bad thing. But they won't say it in those words. They'll tell you that your prices are going to go up, that these crazy populists or that the whoever it is, and they'll put the person you don't like in front of you because there's people on both sides of the aisle that are pushing for more aggressive antitrust. So they can find someone you don't like and they'll say that person is the person doing this thing. And so don't be fooled because this is going to produce a lot of stuff that you don't like. It's going to enable hate speech or it'll foster more hate speech or it'll censor conservative, whatever you don't like. They're going to put that out in front of you. And it's scary to act as a citizen and to say, you know what, I don't like concentrations of power, and I'm not going to believe those people who look really authoritative.
I'm curious about, so I worked for Seaboard Corporation, and for example, they are now the second largest pork producer in the United States. One of the mergers that they embarked on was they bought 50% of Butterball Turkey. And their argument was that through vertical integration, they can make prices cheaper. So maybe just the agriculture industry, and let's take poultry aside, is there any validity to the argument that the bigger these ag companies get, the more they're going to be able to vertically integrate, the cheaper prices they're going to be able to produce for not only American food, but it will also help them compete on the international stage?
No, there isn't. So what's happening there is a rhetorical trick. When somebody comes up and says, this merger is important because it will lower prices, because we'll have economies of scale, you have to be very careful and say, well, what are the actual operational or distributional or creative efficiencies that we are achieving by putting these two things together in a legal sense? So maybe Google as a search engine maybe it's right to have one search engine. I'm not going to say that it is, but let's say they argue, okay, you have economies of scale with that one search engine. It's not necessarily efficient for them to also own YouTube. There's no economy of scale in having one search engine and one video platform and jamming them together in the same firm. And I think that's probably true with poultry and pork. For them, that's about bargaining leverage and bargaining leverage with supermarkets and restaurant companies like Sodexo, as well as bargaining leverage over farmers. That's a legal arrangement, and that's about market power. It's not about operational efficiencies.
There are 6 bills that I believe were co-sponsored by Ken Buck and David Cicilline. That is one of the most conservative members of the House, one of the most progressive members of the House. They came together and these bills did different things, but they were essentially in response to, I believe, Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. So without getting into like all 6 of them, I was wondering if you could get into your views specifically on this bipartisan push to rein in big tech through this legislation, and maybe also help us understand why this isn't breaking down on a partisan line. Why is Matt Gaetz and Paul Gosar voting for something that is written by David Cicilline?
The way that we understand politics is, I think, really impoverished. A lot of our politics is kind of abstract, symbolic manipulation. And when you talk about antitrust, you're actually talking about power in commerce. But the other main reason is that a lot of the anger on antitrust is actually coming from within the business community. And now you're seeing a lot of like the small and medium-sized businesses are really frustrated and angry with the dominant monopolists at this point. A lot of anger at Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple from firms like Yelp and Roku, and also a ton of small businesses. That consensus in the business world is breaking down. So you have anger within both parties. And you have anger in both parties for different reasons, because I know conservatives are very upset with dominant tech firms for a lot of reasons, and progressives are as well. And also conservatives like dominant tech firms, and some progressives like dominant tech firms. So the debates are weird and interesting, and they don't break down on partisan lines as much.
Understanding that there is kind of, at least in the GOP leadership, a push against these big tech legislation, these big tech bills, is there any possibility, do you think, in the future to have these pass as is, or will they get watered down?
I don't know what's going to pass and what's not going to pass. I think some stuff is going to pass this cycle. Generally speaking, the Republican Party is less favorable to stronger antitrust than the Democrats. But that said, the Republican voters, they hate monopolies way more than Democratic voters. And the Republican Party is changing really quickly. So I think if the Republicans take Congress next year, you will see a kind of a slowdown of the anti-monopoly movement. I'm not sure what kind of legislation will move. The real player who's protecting, in my view, who's on the side of Silicon Valley is Jim Jordan. And he's very powerful and he's very important. And he is going to be supportive of dominant tech firms and consumer welfare ideology. But the Republicans they're kind of all over the place. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
I'm stunned that you have this divide between Ken Buck and Jim Jordan is siding on the behalf of these big tech companies. Do you know why? Is there some type of overarching philosophy that he has regarding economics, or is this maybe something else?
His advisor on this is a guy named Tyler Grimm, he's a George Mason card-carrying libertarian and really strong ideologically on the side of the dominant tech firms. Jim Jordan, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, I think Jim Jordan's really smart and he's an extremely good politician. He is more interested in politics than a lot of the policy work. And I say that with respect because I think politics is a real art and skill. So I'm not trying to say anything, but that's like where his heart is. He is a Republican establishment type when it comes to economics. I don't think he's thought it through or rethought his assumptions. And he listens to Tyler and the people around him who are supportive and finances campaigns and various other things. Like, that's who he's still listening to. I think if he spent some time actually thinking about policy or got different policy advisors, he would change. I think what's going to prompt that change is that he's increasingly out of step with the Republican voter. Republican voters don't know that Jim Jordan is on the side of big tech. And when they find out, they don't like it. Right now, people in the Republican Party are too scared to point out that this is what Jim Jordan is doing. And he is a really good politician. So he is able to kind of not let Republican voters know that this is what he's doing. He's very good at avoiding that. At some point, if credible conservatives are able to actually say, let's have this debate, and I think that will happen because it's happening all over the place, it'll be hard for Jordan to maintain his current position.
Matt, another major public figure that you mentioned when you were talking about the attitudes towards antitrust was Clarence Thomas. You wrote an article at the end of January after Stephen Breyer announced his retirement about Stephen Breyer's legacy of destruction, and that Stephen Breyer was really a force for consolidation across his legal career. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What should voters and people in the public know about Breyer's record on antitrust issues?
One of his first jobs was at the antitrust division in the 1960s, where he worked for the first economist who ever ran the antitrust division, this guy named Don Turner. He was an architect of deregulation in the 1970s under Jimmy Carter. He even talked about getting rid of mandates for seatbelts because he believed in cost-benefit analysis, which is again, that's like technocratic fiddling. It sounds good, like a lot of the Chicago School stuff, but it really is just about allowing economists to have a veto point over democratic choices about what kind of rules they want to live by. That's who Stephen Breyer was, and most of his decisions, in fact, when he was a district court judge, he never ruled against a large corporation in an antitrust case. He almost always ruled for the defense. And then he lied about it in his hearing for the Supreme Court. He was understood by, there's a senator named Howard Metzenbaum in the 1980s and 90s who was sort of the last kind of populist type. And he understood that Stephen Breyer was for the monopolist. That's who he believed in. And he had this kind of pro-efficiency mindset. And then when he went on the court, he signed on to unanimous decisions in the 2000s that eviscerated antitrust law, including one which is called Verizon v. Trinco, in which the court actually said that monopoly is not only not illegal, monopoly is a good thing in the free market system, that monopolization is what incentivizes business people to do what they do. I mean, it's just a crazy opinion, and it got rid of the monopolization law. You know, Stephen Breyer signed on to it. So did Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then you could just go into his track record. His legacy of antitrust is one of plutocracy. It's not why the monopolists won. It's worse than that. It's why there was zero debate as they won. And that's, I think, the most important thing to understand about antitrust is it's not that there was this spirited debate and the monopolists won that debate and then it kind of like we went back and forth. It's that for some reason in the late 1970s, and I have a book on this that's out, it's called Goliath, where I describe why the monopolists not only won, but they ended the debate. And so for 40 years, really until people like Lina Khan emerged, we just never even argued about it anymore. We said that's just old fuddy-duddy stuff. The economists run the world now and they know how to do things.
So we will go to Roger and then we will go to Aram for the last question. Roger, over to you.
Why are you now blaming Republicans for this when you know yourself through your own research that Glass-Steagall was repealed by Bill Clinton? So I don't get what you're coming from. Like you don't make any sense to me.
Bill Clinton was terrible. Among other things that he did, he screwed up our shipping with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 1998, and Glass-Steagall and derivatives, and just a terrible president, probably one of the worst presidents we've ever had. And he also put Stephen Breyer on the court. I'm not a Democratic partisan. I am a Democrat, but I'm not a Democratic partisan. When I was talking about Republicans, I was just saying that the Republican establishment is in a different place than the Republican voters. And I'm seeing the change happen really quickly on the Republican side. It happened a little earlier on the Democratic side. I mean, Obama was a terrible president too. I think George Bush was a terrible president. But it's not a coincidence that Google and Facebook and Amazon became dominant under Obama. And at the same time, he also consolidated power in the healthcare industry with the ACA and with Dodd-Frank. I mean, these were basically the consumerist philosophy of the Democratic Party, saying, let's consolidate power and then we can put a regulatory overlay on top of it to achieve social benefits that we believe in, which is very much to your point, which is that a lot of these monopolies are government created. Markets, to me, when you look at market structure, they're always political. They've always been political. You can go back to the 1500s, the 1600s. You can go to the origin of the corporate charter. The corporate charter itself is a political choice, and we've always made lots of different choices about how we charter corporations and how we structure markets. So the question isn't so much whether, it's the public or private sector that are responsible, because I'm not sure that such a dividing line makes so much sense, especially when you have things like public standards, right, that people can build on top of. Is that public? Is that private? Is it like a lot of these definitions don't really make that much sense? I think the question that I always look at, is there an arbitrary or coercive concentration of power? And you can certainly, I think, monopolists do use government, and government does use monopolists in arbitrary and coercive ways. We've always seen that. You could say that that's communism. You could say it's fascism. You could definitely find examples here, and there are plenty, and I could name them. But the ultimate question is there an unfair, arbitrary use of political and economic power? And what's the best way to address that? And oftentimes the best way is to change some government regulation that's inhibiting competition. Sometimes it's to go after the dominant firm itself, it's a bunch of publicly chartered corporations that have all merged, right? So those are all government charters. There's often changes of licenses. The question really shouldn't be, is it public, is it private? The question is, are we a free people? And is there coercion happening through our markets or through other mechanisms? And if there is, how do we stop that coercion? How do we protect ourselves? How do we maintain ourselves as a free people? So that's how I think about it. And I understand where you're coming from, and I agree with you on some things and not on others.
We are going to go to Aram for the last question. So over to you, Aram.
It seems to me like there's a number of parts of our economy. I have serious questions about whether or not they just need to be utilities. There's things in like telecommunications, for example, like providing broadband, where it's just not feasible to have a whole lot of competition. And even where you can have competition, it's kind of only within a relatively narrow context. Would something like a search engine potentially make sense to be a public utility where we have Google, I think, is something like 80% market share? Are these things better handled as utilities rather than sort of breaking them up because there is something to having them be singular?
If you look at Lina Khan's paper, she proposes two different solutions for Amazon One of them is kind of traditional antitrust law, and the other is public utility law. I think that we have a lot of work to do to understand how to bring public utility principles back to our economy, because we got rid of them. But we just have all these parts of the economy that we need to bring back public utility principles, and we just don't necessarily have the expertise to do that. But we're starting to see it happen. You guys noticed the massive jam up at the ports because of the COVID and the shipping mess. So Port of Long Beach and LA is just there's just backups there. There's a whole bunch of things that are really screwed up about our shipping. And Congress is probably going to pass a bill called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which would apply public utility rules back to the shipping sector. And I think we're seeing that, there are debates about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which has to do with big tech. There's public utility principles involved in that. There are public utility principles involved in privacy and data regulation. So I'm 100% there. And I think we should even consider things like public ownership models, because sometimes a public ownership model might make the best sense. And so I think it's a really important area to study. I'm glad you brought it up, because it is part of the whole anti-monopoly framework, which is not, in my view, about just making sure there's more competition, because you can have competition in bad ways too. It's about making sure that there's no domination in a society, that we are a free people and that we have the right to pursue the trade that we wish to pursue, not the guarantee of success, but the right to try without being coerced by arbitrary economic or political power.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Matt Stoller, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or to hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Monday featuring Julia Davis of The Daily Beast. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.